is the greatest honor to be able to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Philadelphia 11. 11 brave, able, brilliant, faithful women who were ordained July 29, 1974, amidst much controversy and much joy. Their act and the participation by the bishops willing to take part was a living icon of the church moving at times, even if those in power have not decided it should. An incarnation that the spirit and the leading of it belongs to all the faithful, not just those of us granted positions of authority. That is never an easy decision or one that should be made lightly. In this group, I believe we found 11 people of faith that prayed their way to that day. The Church of the Advocate in Philadelphia was the site for this event. The senior warden at the time, Barbara Harris, who flew back from an Urban League meeting in San Francisco to make sure she was there, was the crucifer in the service. She was later to become the first woman bishop in the Anglican Communion and a trusted colleague in the House of Bishops I'm so glad to have. The rector of that church, Church of the Advocate, was Paul Washington, an amazing and bold priest, a predominantly African-American church. He and that congregation knew oppression and knew when doors had to be opened. I was so very blessed to meet him some years ago before his death and to hear him preach. Bozarth Campbell, one of the 11, in writing about that day wrote this: "Before the service began, we were organizing ourselves for the procession in the vesting area. We couldn't see, but we could hear what happened next in the church proper. We heard a roaring noise, but didn't know what it was. Paul Washington had gone out to greet those present, and when he came back to cue us with a huge grin on his face, and we all looked puzzled and concerned. He said that he had told the congregation, including the dissenters who would speak for 15 minutes in a place kept for them in the service, that if a doctor tells a woman she's going to have a baby in October, and the baby is ready to be born, and its mother is having contractions in July, it is the baby and the mother who are right, and not the doctor." Then he announced the opening hymn. He said, "Please join me in singing the opening hymn, 'Come Labor On.'" He said, what you all heard was the sound of 2,000 people laughing. Paul Washington said once, "This is not the church of the comfortable pew. There comes a time when we must act, not because it's traditional, not because it's acceptable, but because conscience says it is right." We can and should celebrate how far we have come. We should celebrate the 11 who put themselves forward, the 3 bishops willing to ordain them, and even the entire Episcopal Church that listened and eventually came to the same conclusions. As in all such controversies, I give thanks for the 11 who, even after the ordinations, had truly difficult times in the church and yet stayed with it. For those that were greatly distressed by the decision and yet did the same, stayed with the church. That kind of love is Christian love, and it's one of the greatest witnesses that comes from this. So today we celebrate those 11, those days, this church. We still have a long way to go. Come labor on is still the call today. Greetings to all who are watching today. We are discussing the 40th anniversary of the Philadelphia 11 as we honor and celebrate that event. And with me today are Canon Janet Campbell and the Reverend Sarah Monroe. And we're just going to have a discussion about the Philadelphia 11. I think I might start by asking you two how long you've been ordained.
I've been ordained 25 years. I was ordained in the Diocese of Long Island in the group of 3 who were the first women to be ordained there. And I'm actually, having served 25 years, I'm now retired, except that I am working in the diocese as a canon for liturgy, and also I'm now interim priest at Christ Church Tacoma.
Great. Sarah, what about you?
I have been ordained as a priest for 2 months. I think I'm the most recently ordained person in the Diocese of Olympia. I am currently serving attached to St. Andrew's, Aberdeen, and most of what I do is street ministry.
What do you all remember or know of the Philadelphia 11, and how do they inspire you?
When I came into the church a couple of years later, the parish that I was drawn to was an Anglo-Catholic parish, and there was a great deal of joking about this bizarre event that had happened, in a very unfortunate way. While I was in seminary, I did field work with Nancy Wittig in her parish in Hasbrook Heights, New Jersey, and if I had any questions about kind of both the sort of just human gifts, but also some of the special gifts that women bring to ordained ministry, certainly Nancy was really key in my seeing that. It was wonderful working with her.
Sarah, what about you?
So I was not born when the Philadelphia 11 were ordained, but I do feel like I have some relationship to the event. I'm not a cradle Episcopalian. I come into the Episcopal Church with an evangelical background, and so growing up in a fundamentalist Baptist environment, the majority of, actually all of the clergy, all of the leadership in the church was always male. I never remember a time where I didn't have a call toward ministry, but I also never experienced women in ministry. It was the first time that I saw a woman serving at the altar was in the Episcopal Church, and a lot of what drew me into the Episcopal Church was the fact that women were fully welcomed into leadership. The other relationship that I had with the Philadelphia 11 was that I went to Episcopal Divinity School, where Carter Hayward, of course, looms very large as a figure that impacted that school. I met her, and I also spent quite a bit of time with Barbara Harris, the first female bishop in the Episcopal Church.
It was the crucifer at that service.
Yes,
and the senior warden of Church of the Advocate.
Yes. And she definitely has made a huge impact on me. I should also mention that at Episcopal Divinity School, Suzanne Hyatt was also a teacher there, who is also one of the Philadelphia.
Yeah,
both her and Carter were.
Right.
EDS was one of the first to employ the Philadelphia 11 and allow them to celebrate Eucharist.
Definitely the first seminary of ours that did.
Yes.
And put them on faculty and gave them a place, absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah. We have a connection in the Diocese of Olympia. Some people, it's a little bit of a distance, but not too much. If you read about this, you'll hear about the Washington Four, which was an ordination that happened just not too long after this one. And in that group was supposed to be the Reverend Phyllis Edwards, who was a deaconess, and then James Pike made her a deacon. And that was controversial. And her connection, her family's from here. I think she's ultimately from here. And I had the great honor of presiding at her funeral at St. Andrew's, Port Angeles, where her family is. So we have kind of a connection that way as well. You know, it's easy for us to look back on events like this and say, well, that was then, you know, we don't have that now. What do you think about when I ask you that? What are the parallels of today in the church?
So I think that there are many. My particular passion, as the bishop knows very well, is my background is also in a working class and rural background, which is not well represented in the church, and particularly in the Episcopal Church. And I think that if we really are serious about women leadership in the church, we have to realize that the majority of women, the majority of queer people, the majority of young people, and the majority of people of color, all people we say we want to include in leadership, that the majority are poor and working class people. And so that we really have to talk about challenging the structures of the church that favor and privilege middle and upper middle class and white. There's a danger in thinking that we arrived at the beloved community, that we are there.
Arriving when we're a people that are supposed to be on a journey is always a danger. I think that's great that you flag that. And that the Philadelphia 11 really, although they were ordained on that day in July 1974, they really had a struggle after that about serving. The church was not very welcoming about that. So, and that particular struggle, I would say, continues.
Absolutely.
For sure.
I experienced some of that struggle in my movement through the process in Long Island, because when I began in the process, women were not being ordained to the priesthood in Long Island, and it was a huge political issue there. And I mean, people used to say, well, you can't buy a typewriter in this diocese without putting forth your position on the ordination of women. You know, the particular parallel I see today that I'm very aware of, because I've just come back from a conference dealing with it, is this question of whether gay people can be married, whether they are appropriate matter for the sacrament of marriage, or whether we will draw some line at this thing of, well, we can bless them, but we cannot celebrate a marriage with them. And what I'm aware of is the similarity and the complexity of the issues. I mean, there is every aspect of who we are as a church to deal with. It's political, it's ecclesiological, it's sacramental theology, it's justice, it's all of those things, and people trying to weave, you know, find a gospel path through it all. It's amazing to me that for people on a journey in which we should be out in front in terms of issues of justice, it's frequently our culture that finds the way first, and then we have to respond. And that's, for all that we stand over against a lot of what our culture is, that's a phenomenon that's really interesting to me.
Paul Washington, who was rector of Church of the Advocate then, he said either then or around that time he was quite out on social issues, but he said, you know, sometimes the church acts not because it's traditional, not because it's acceptable, but because it's the right time and God chooses to act. And of course that's a delicate thing, because everyone's thought about, well, the Holy Spirit is calling us to do this is different, because we're human. Philadelphia 11 were out in front of the church. They were definitely out in front of the church. They're pushing the church in a way, to pulling the church to something new. I think it's a gift of Anglicanism, of the Episcopal, and yet it's also a burden for us, and it can be a conflict like this was.
Yeah, well, you know, for all of the sort of institutional sluggishness that we have around kind of moving forward in the question of whether a gay relationship can be a marriage, for all of that, in this conference that I was at, there are churches who have not gotten to that point yet, who are saying, thank you for being out there and pulling us. So, even though we're kind of roiling around and trying to figure it out, we are, like the Philadelphia 11, in a sense, pulling other churches toward paying attention to this issue.
That's a very generous response to say it's a gift, a blessing that you're pulling us, pushing us.
It was.
Not always the
that is true.
not. Yeah.
That is true, and that's that delicate place. Remaining in relationship while struggling toward a full realization of the gospel, which will not come in our time or anyone's time except God's time.
Sarah, any thoughts on that?
I don't think that institutions ever change themselves without some help.
Yeah.
You know, and so I think that it's important for, first, to acknowledge the issues. I think it still is hard to be a woman in leadership in the church, and it's particularly hard to be a queer woman in leadership in the church. And I think that we have to first be able to say that. And I think that we do need to push and pull the church in directions and be willing to be a prophetic voice, even when it's difficult. I think that is the catalyst for change. That is what.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the sort of dynamic of community that God calls us into, that there is the sort of inertia of the community, which is a check on people shooting off in all directions, and yet there is the pull of people who are saying, but the church needs to go here, and we need both those.
This is another hard question probably, but if you both had the chance to talk to the Philadelphia 11, if they were sitting in the room, what would you say to them?
I would say, thank you. That I ache for the sacrifices that you had to make, what you have accomplished on behalf of the church and for God's sake. must bring you great joy. I mean, this huge, rushing violent wind of fresh air has blown through the church because of what those women dared to do, and their bishops too.
Yeah, great.
I would say thank you. You made it possible for there to be a church that I could live out my call, that I could find a place to do my ministry and to live out my call. And also, thank you for the example of so many of the Philadelphia 11 were ministers who had a tremendous example of ministry on the margins and ministry outside of the box in the church. Really pushed the church not just in terms of women in ministry, but what ministry could look like outside of what we think of as traditional church ministry. They pushed the church.
Yeah. So interviewers, and I'm not much of one, but they always think they've asked every good question, but typically they haven't. So I'd say to both of you, is there something we didn't even, a path we didn't even head down that you'd want to say about this? Anything you want to add that we haven't asked today?
They made it possible for there to be a church in which I could be and offer my gifts. The whole body of Christ has been brought to a much fuller manifestation in the church through this. And it's exciting to me. And who knows, I mean, the amount of time, 40 years is a long time, and it's but a moment. What will people say 40 years from now? When I won't be here and you'll be my age, what will people be saying then? And what will the church be like then? It's very exciting.
Yeah.
If we aren't a church that's committed to women in poor and rural communities and women in poor and working class communities, women in inner cities, if we're not committed to empowering them to be leaders in the church, to be catechists, to be deacons, to be priests, to even be bishops, and to empower us to work in those communities, in poor and working class communities. If we're not doing that, then I think that we certainly have not fulfilled the dream of the Philadelphia 11.
Yeah. Yeah.
We haven't talked a lot, you mentioned, but we haven't talked a lot about kind of other groups. Latino people,
yes.
Other people of color. How do the gifts there become active in the life of the church? I mean, here we are, three white people,
yes,
talking about this, and the Philadelphia 11 were all
white women. Yes, they were.
It was very exciting to see Barbara Harris consecrated bishop, and although I always have felt that the mitre is one of the funnier things that we have as appointments in the church, when she put that on for the first time, the sign of that was just tremendous, and that she was a person of color, a woman of color, was really important in that too. But we're kind of a long way from the people that we can be, the body that we can be, the full body of Christ.
Yes.
Well, generally, I think the mitre doesn't look good on most people, but it sure looks good on her.
It did. It did.
On Barbara Harris, most things look good.
Most things look good, that's true.
Yes.
Well, I think too that there's a tremendous burden in being the first of anything. And you mentioned the rushing wind of the Holy Spirit and Pentecost, and around that time we hear a lot about witness, to be a witness, and I kind of delved into that word a little more lately. Witness, the definition we kind of don't use sometimes is to give or to serve as evidence of, and the Philadelphia 11 did that, and they carried a tremendous burden and did it, I'd have to say, so well. that it's not just what happened on that day, it's how they carried it out after that day is a tremendous legacy that we owe them a great deal for. This church will always owe them. Thank you for being here for this discussion of the Philadelphia 11. I think everyone watching, being able to witness you, witnesses the legacy of the Philadelphia 11 in a great way, so thank you very much for being here.